The death penalty is a warning, just like a lighthouse throwing its beams out to sea. We hear about shipwrecks, but we do not hear about the ships the lighthouse guides safely on their way. We do not have proof the number of ships it saves, but we do not tear the lighthouse down. That was said by poet Hyman Barchet. As a citizen of our country who pays taxes and wants to feel safe as I go about my life, I think that the death penalty is very relevant to me and to the rest of you. All the records and rulings in death penalty cases are available to the public, so as members of society we can look for those and find those if we want. Capital punishment has kind of been a very popular and heated topic as we had the election at the end of last year, and many of the states are evaluating their own laws and practices. Capital punishment helps cut down on the costs of housing prisoners, gives consolation to victims, and sets an example that hopefully will deter other people from committing or recommitting crimes. I'm going to discuss just what capital punishment or the death penalty is and why we need it, as well as how it benefits us as Americans today. So do we really need the death penalty, and do people really know what it is? Capital punishment is the politically correct term for the death penalty. It's existed since ancient times. Its practices have changed somewhat over the years, but some remain the same. It continues to be used today. Whether you've heard about it a lot or not kind of depends on how much you dive into media. 36 state governments and federal governments have reinstated the death penalty, and in 2002 it was ruled by a jury that a jury is needed to convict an inmate and not just a judge. I think that this makes it a lot more fair. If you have one crooked judge, they could be causing a lot of damage and ruining a lot of lives, but hopefully we believe in the justice system that we have, and that a jury can kind of help make it more fair. There are 60 crimes that are punishable by the death penalty. From 2000 to 2011, in the U.S. alone, 192,452 reported murders occurred, and that's straight off of the FBI's website. From 1970 to 2009, 9,772 people were executed. So that's a much larger year span and a much smaller number of people who actually were on death row and executed. So now I'm going to explore some of the pros of keeping capital punishment in state. A major discussion and worry on everyone's mind, especially if you pay taxes, is the cost of things. The long-term cost of keeping thousands of criminals alive far exceeds the upfront court costs of death row inmates. One of the largest arguments against capital punishment is that it costs so much, when in reality the thing that racks up the price of it is the appeals process and not necessarily the actual death row process. On average, about $25,000 a year is what it costs per inmate to keep them in prison. And from some other research that I did, poverty level in the United States last year was about $16,000 earned income. So that's almost $10,000 more that it costs to keep an inmate alive than some families have to survive on that are working. If multiple layers of appeals are pursued in an ethical and fiscally responsible manner, execution is less costly than warehousing a murderer for life. And that was said by Gary D. Beatty, who was a Florida state attorney. It is not cheaper to keep a criminal confined because most of the time he will appeal just as much, causing as many costs as a convict under death sentence. Being alive and having nothing better to do, he will spend his time in prison conceiving, if ever, new habeas corpus petitions, which, being unlimited in effect, cannot be rejected by the judicial system. The cost is higher. And that was said by Edwin H. Sutherland, who is the president of the American Sociological Society. While inmates are in prison, we pay for them to eat, sleep, get educations, appeal their cases, and overload the prisons that we already have. I also believe that sometimes, and not for everyone, being in prison kind of becomes a lifestyle for them. I can remember several years ago reading about a man who had just served 10 years in prison for getting his 12th DUI, which is very hazardous to the rest of us. And he was out 2 days before he got his 13th DUI and was sent back to prison. I think people just get used to it, and it's where they feel comfortable. I know that I get in a comfort zone, and that's the habits that I keep. But if we were treating people so well in prison that it's more fun or perhaps easier to be there than to get out and get a job or find things to do, then I don't think that's really responsible of us. Victims' families can also get peace. Many victims or their families feel like they deserve some form of restitution. While nothing can bring back their loved ones, justice being served can often offer the closure that they need. Victims in Connecticut have a constitutional right to make a statement to the court at sentencing, and the Commission strongly believes that victims' impact statements are and should be a critical part of the criminal justice process. In many cases, victims' friends and relatives want to be there and hear the accused and have them understand the impact that the crime has had on them. And that was said by the State of Connecticut's Commission on the Death Penalty. Lots of people argue that victims shouldn't have the right to face the criminals that have perhaps changed their lives. And while the justice system is fair and this plays only a small part in the court proceedings, it is fair for victims to get to voice their pain, face the accused, and state their opinion. I think that closure is a big deal for people, and not that if you had a loved one murdered, having someone put on death row makes it right, but I think that we have a justice system for a reason and we should use it. As I've discussed earlier, and in conclusion, the death penalty is a well-regulated piece of our judicial system. It has served a large purpose throughout history for our country and other nations across the world. As members of society, it is our right to feel safe and protected, and as if we can rely on the laws that govern our nation. It is our right to support these laws and keep the balance of justice in our great country. If we execute murderers and there is in fact no deterrent effect, we have killed a bunch of murderers. If we fail to execute murderers and doing so would in fact have deterred other murderers, we have allowed the killing of a bunch of innocent victims. I'd much rather risk the former. This to me is not a tough call, and that's said by Don McAdams, who works for Marquette University.